All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with yours truly. This time, we are going to be digging into something that I think we can all relate to, and that is how one project going off the rails can totally derail everything else that you're working on.
Oh, yeah.
And this is something that I've definitely experienced personally. You start out with all these great plans, and then one little thing goes wrong, and then it's just like a domino effect.
Domino effect. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And the source that we're going to be looking at today is this really insightful article by 𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗀, and it's called When One Project Derails Others. Right off the bat, we're getting into some real talk here.
Yeah, no kidding.
But what really struck me was this idea of scope creep, acting like a silent thief. It kind of sneaks up on you, and before you know it, it's stolen all your time, your budget, your sanity.
Well, it's funny you should say that because that's a really apt metaphor. I think a lot of people think of scope creep as this big dramatic event, like suddenly the entire project changes. But more often than not, it's these tiny little incremental additions.
Right, death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly. And those are the ones that are really dangerous because they're so easy to overlook. You think, oh, it's just a small change, it won't hurt. But then those small changes start to add up, and before you know it, you're way over budget, way behind schedule, and the whole project is in jeopardy.
Yeah, and that's where the domino effect really comes in, right? Because if you're already stretched thin on one project and then another one starts to go off the rails, it can create this cascade of problems that can impact your entire portfolio.
Absolutely. It's like you said, you start out with all these great plans, all these projects that you're excited about, but then one thing goes wrong and it just kind of ripples outward. Maybe you have to pull resources from one project to put out a fire on another, or maybe one delay causes a chain reaction of delays across multiple projects. And pretty soon you're in this situation where everything is behind schedule, everything is over budget, and you're just constantly trying to play catch up.
So how do we avoid this? Like, how do we stop the dominoes from falling in the first place?
Well, the article talks about the importance of prioritization, which I think is absolutely key. When you have limited resources, limited time, limited budget, you can't do everything at once. So you need to be really strategic about what you choose to focus on.
Yeah, that makes sense. But how do you actually do that? Like in the real world, how do you decide which projects are the most important?
Well, there are a lot of different frameworks and methodologies you can use, but the article highlights one in particular called the 𝗲𝗏𝗀 method.
The Moscow Mac.
Yeah, it stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. So basically, you go through all the features or requirements for your project and you categorize them according to those 4 categories.
So the must-haves are the things that are absolutely essential.
Yeah.
The things that the project can't live without.
Exactly. And then the should-haves are the things that would be nice to have but aren't essential. And then the could-haves are the things that would be even nicer to have but you can definitely live without. And then the won't-haves are the things that are just totally out of scope for this particular project.
So it's like a hierarchy of needs for your project.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a really helpful framework because it forces you to be really clear about what's important and what's not. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a project and want to do everything. But the reality is that you can't. And so being able to say no to certain features or requirements is really important.
And I imagine this is especially important when you're dealing with scope creep, right? Because if you have a clear understanding of what's essential and what's not, it's easier to push back on those little incremental additions that can derail the whole project.
Absolutely. If someone comes to you with a new feature request, you can say, okay, well, is this a must-have? Is this a should-have? Or is this a could-have? And if it's not a must-have, then you can have a conversation about whether it's really worth adding to the scope of the project.
Right. And that kind of leads into another key takeaway from the article, which is the importance of communication.
Yes. Communication is absolutely crucial. Everyone involved in the project needs to be on the same page about the goals, the priorities, the timeline, and any changes that are made along the way.
Yeah, because if people aren't communicating effectively, then it's easy for things to fall through the cracks, for misunderstandings to happen, for scope creep to sneak in.
Exactly. And I think this is where a lot of projects go wrong. People are afraid to speak up or they assume that everyone else is on the same page when they're not. And then before you know it, you have this big mess on your hands.
So clear and consistent communication is key. And that means not just communicating with your team, but also with your stakeholders, with your clients, with anyone who has a vested interest in the project.
Right. You need to keep everyone informed about what's going on, what the progress is, what the challenges are, and any decisions that are being made.
And I think it's also important to be proactive about communication.
Mm-hmm.
Don't wait until there's a problem to start talking to people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Have regular check-ins, schedule meetings, send out status updates. Just keep the lines of communication open and make sure that everyone is in the loop.
All right, so we've talked about the importance of prioritization, the importance of communication, and the Moscow method. Is there anything else that we can do to prevent scope creep and keep our projects from derailing?
Well, the article also talks about the importance of having a clear and well-defined project scope from the outset. This is something that you should do at the very beginning of the project before you even start working on it.
So basically, you need to sit down with all the stakeholders and figure out exactly what you're trying to achieve with this project, what the deliverables are, what the timeline is, what the budget is.
Exactly. And you need to be as specific as possible. Don't leave anything open to interpretation because that's just asking for trouble.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to have a process for managing changes to the scope if they do come up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You need to have a change control process in place so that if someone does come to you with a new feature request or a change to the requirements, you can evaluate it carefully and make a decision about whether to incorporate it into the project.
Right, and that decision shouldn't be made lightly. You need to consider the impact of the change on the timeline, on the budget, on the resources, and you need to make sure that everyone is on board with the decision.
Exactly. And if you do decide to incorporate the change, you need to document it carefully and update the project plan accordingly.
So it's all about being proactive, being organized, being communicative, and being willing to say no.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
All right, so that's our deep dive on scope creep and how it can derail your projects. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope you found it helpful.
Me too.
So before we go, I'd like to leave you with a question to ponder. Thinking about your current projects, what's one step you could take today to prevent scope creep and protect your entire portfolio?
It's something to think about.
And that's our show for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.